Good morning, Dr. Thierry. Are you able to hear us?
Yeah, it's okay. Good morning or good afternoon for you. I can hear perfectly.
We will start a little formal introduction. We will spend a few minutes. Then I think then the platform will be handed over to you. So before that, on behalf of Indian Association for Radiation Protection, we thank you for accepting the invitation immediately. And I can again wish all the participants to make use of this nice presentation from one of the ICRP chair. And this is the new initiative started by Indian Association for Radiation Protection along with Young Professional Group, which is initiated during the AOCRP 6. And this we would like to continue every month. And one of the objective of IRP is to disseminate the knowledge from the eminent personality all over the world. And this is the one initiative by this YPG group, Young Professional Group actually. And this is the inaugural lecture. So we again thank you very much for accepting. Yeah. Okay. And I request Ms. Ria to introduce the speaker, and then Dr. Thierry will start his lecture. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Ria, please. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Thierry is the director of the Nuclear Protection Evaluation Center, CEPN, in Fontioux-Roses, France. He has a PhD in economics from Paris Dauphine University with a focus on health and insurance. He is the chair of Committee 4 in charge of the application of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, ICRP, since 2021, and the chair of the Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health, CRPPH, NEA, OECD, since 2020. He has been involved in research projects related to the assessment and management of the radiological risk and to the methodological approach for optimization of radiological protection, including societal and ethical. A large part of his research is dedicated to post-accident management since 1990 at national, European, and international levels, dealing with the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much for this introduction and for this nice invitation. This is my pleasure to give the lecture, and I really encourage this initiative by the Indian Society. It's a very good initiative. So let me share my screen. Is that okay? You can see the screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So today I will give you an overview of the current development from ICRP on the concept of reasonableness and tolerability. So first of all, the question of tolerability of risk and the search for reasonableness. This is at the heart of what we call the ALARA approach, the as low as reasonably achievable approach, and the optimization principle. The two questions that we have to put on the agenda for a given exposure situation is, first of all, can the doses received or potentially received by exposed person be considered tolerable with regard to the radiation-induced risk? And on the other side, are all exposure maintained or reduced to the lowest level reasonably achievable, taking into account economic and societal factors? This is what is currently mentioned in ICRP, but we also progressively put economic, environmental, and societal factors to be in line with current discussion on UN Sustainable Development Goals. So tolerability and reasonableness has been largely developed in ICRP publication 60 and more recently in publication 101, the second part B, which was published in 28. 26, sorry. So the content of my presentation is the following. I will come back on historical perspective, just to remind you some key points and to give you the relevant ICRP publication. And then I will give you an overview of the current discussion, revisiting the framework for tolerability and reasonableness. And I'm chairing a task group from ICRP on this topic since a few years. And then we will discuss briefly the application of this new framework. And finally, I will give you some remaining challenges where, in fact, that could be some topics of further development where Indian participants can clearly contribute in the future. So first of all, the historical perspective. This is interesting to see that the concept of tolerability and reasonableness, that was not exactly mentioned like that, but they were already present in the principle in the first publication of ICRP in 1959. We can read in this first publication that faced with the existing uncertainty as to the dose-effect relationship for somatic effect, the Commission recommends that all doses be kept as low as practicable. So that was not reasonable, but practicable or achievable. And then it was interesting to notice that ICRP, recognizing that man could not avoid completely the use of ionizing radiation, concludes that in practice, it is necessary to limit doses so that the risk is not unacceptable. So this is, again, the reference to the tolerability of risk, which was mentioned. And it is interesting to mention that this acceptability was discussed both for individual and the population at large. Then in publication 26, if you have in mind the different publication from ICRP, the publication 26 clearly introduced the concept of optimization in 1977. And in this publication, it was mentioned that the aim of radiation protection should be to prevent detrimental non-stochastic effect and to limit the probability of stochastic effect to levels deemed to be acceptable. And for non-stochastic effect, the prevention of non-stochastic effect would be achieved by setting dose equivalent limits and sufficiently low value so that no threshold dose would be reached, even following exposure for the whole of the lifetime or for the total period of working life. Having said that, for the stochastic effect, the objective was to fix dose limit accordingly to refer to the tolerability of risk. And then the formula which was used was to derive the annual dose criteria from a level of tolerable annual risk divided by the dose risk coefficient. So you can, based on the concept of detriment introduced by ICRP, you can easily define what is the annual criteria if you know the level of tolerability of risk that you want to reach. That means for occupational exposure, in publication 26, the Commission introduced that for judging the acceptability of the level of risk in radiation work, it was to compare this risk with that of other occupational situation recognized as having high standard of safety. At that time, that was notably in industry that people were able to find a level of mortality, average annual mortality, and then the objective was to have something not exceeding 10-4 as average annual of mortality. And then ICRP mentioned that taking into account the distribution of individual exposure, it is assumed that where the Commission system of dose limitation has been applied, then the resultant annual average dose equivalent is no greater than 1/10 of the annual limit. So that was both the notion of fixing a limit, but also having in mind that finally, when you have a limit, you know that more or less you will be 10 times lower. And then it was mentioned that the adoption of an annual dose limit of 50 millisieverts for occupational exposure, assuming to result in an average of around 5 millisieverts for the working population. And then this corresponds according to the risk the risk that we had of 5 × 10⁻⁵ per year for fatal cancer and 2 × 10⁻⁵ for hereditary effect. Then a similar consideration was introduced for public exposure. And from the review of available information related to risk regularly accepted in everyday life, ICRP concludes that the order of magnitude was in the range of 10⁻⁶ to 10⁻⁵ per year. And then based on the detriment at that time, which was 10⁻² per sievert for fatal cancer, the restriction would correspond to 1 millisievert per year. And then the adoption of a dose limit of 5 millisieverts for a public exposure with the same consideration of if you have a limit of 5 millisieverts for the public, most of the population will be, the distribution will be around 0.5 millisieverts. So that was the idea to respect this range of value from 10⁻⁶ to 10⁻⁵. Then it was interesting to see that in publication 60, this concept of tolerability and reasonableness was reinforced, and the reference was made to what we call the tolerability of risk model. This tolerability of risk model was largely developed and discussed by Royal Society in the UK at the beginning of 80s. And then it was mentioned that for exposure to radiation, no safe level can be demonstrated. So this is interesting that even at that time you refer to the LNT model. And then it was referred to a prudent attitude, and it is prudent management in the absence of other evidence to assume that there is no threshold. And in addition to any upper limit of exposure that is set, the further and more stringent requirement of reduction so far is reasonably practicable or achievable also apply. So the idea is really to say that you fix a limit, but then due to the LNT model, you need to optimize below the limit and to reach something which is reasonably practicable or achievable. And then it was also something further developed by the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. The first report was published in 88 and revised in 92. And the report is a tolerability of risk from nuclear power station. You can find this report easily on the web page from the UK. Then it's led ICRP publication 60 to introduce a model of tolerability with 3 levels: unacceptable risk, tolerable risk, and acceptable risk. The unacceptable risk means that the first word is unacceptable, which is used to indicate that the exposure would, in the Commission view, not be acceptable on any reasonable basis in the normal operation. For tolerable risk, exposures that are not unacceptable, so this is a double negation, not unacceptable, are then subdivided into those that are tolerable, meaning that they are not welcome, but can reasonably be tolerated. And then below the tolerable risk, you can reach an acceptable level of risk, meaning that they can be accepted without further improvement. And then this reach to the model introduced in ICRP publication 60 with a level of individual exposure reaching the unacceptable risk. you have the limit, which gives a border between unacceptable risk and tolerable risk, and then you apply optimization to reach the ALARA level, which is the acceptable residual risk. I will come back on this model and the revisions that we have proposed recently in ICRP Task Group 114. So then, in publication 60, in case of workers, the Commission rely on consideration about lifetime dose to justify the value of 20 millisievert per year. You have to remember, before we had a value of 50 millisievert per year, and then the Commission discussed, due to the evolution of the detriment moved from 10 minus 2 per sievert in publication 26 to 5 10 minus 2 per sievert in publication 60. And then the discussion was how to fix the limit. And then the Commission discussed in publication 60 that the aim is to establish for a defined set of practice a level of dose above which the consequences for the individual would be widely regarded as unacceptable. And then there was discussion about the length of life lost and also some consideration on incidence of non-fatal condition. In the case of public, the Commission referred to natural exposure to justify the value of 1 millisievert. So we were no more directly focused on the risk on the daily life, but the variation in the existing level of dose from natural sources. And then the idea was that this natural background may not be harmless, but it makes only a small contribution to the health detriment which society experiences. And then it's considered that a variation around the natural background could be hardly called unacceptable. And this is the reason why the Commission proposed in publication 60 in 1990 to adopt the value of the limit of 1 millisievert for practice in case of a public exposure. Then moving to reasonableness, this is interesting to see that, as I mentioned to you, the concept of reasonableness was already introduced in publication 1 in 1959, but it was also in the previous recommendation from ICRP, which were not in the annals of ICRP, but in 1955, it was already mentioned to reduce exposure to the lowest possible. Then we moved to as low as practicable. Then we moved to as readily achievable, economic and social consideration being taken into account. Then in publication 22, we have reasonably achievable instead of readily. And then that was the same in 26, taking into account economic and social factors. And then in the last publication for ICRP in publication 103 in 2007, the concept of reasonableness was introduced to reasonably achievable, economic, and not only social, but societal factors being taken into account. And as I mentioned to you, more recently, in some publication of ICRP, we mentioned economic, environmental, and societal factors being taken into account. So coming back to publication 22, which is an interesting publication because beyond the tolerability of risk, to address the question of reasonableness, ICRP refer to the cost-benefit analysis. And you can see in this paragraph from publication 22 in 1973, it is mentioned that it is then helpful to express the population dose not only in man-rems or man-sievert, but also in social and economic terms, and for example, in terms of detriment or monetary units, so that the advantage of a reduction in collective dose can be compared directly with the detriment or cost of achieving this reduction. And then we had at that time introduced a cost-benefit analysis relying on economic rationality. And if you are familiar with cost-benefit analysis, then you rely on the collective exposure on the axis, x-axis, and then you refer to the cost on the other axis, and then you check the cost of protection will reduce when you increase the collective exposure, or reversely, when you put more protection, you will reduce the collective exposure. And then the idea is to compare to the cost of detriment. For a lower collective exposure, you will have a lower cost of detriment, and reverse for higher collective exposure. And the objective is to find the optimum solution with a total cost for cost of protection plus the cost of detriment. But of course, the question at this stage is how to define the monetary value of the man-sievert. And then I refer to a recent paper published in 2020 by some of my colleagues. You can find this paper on the journal Radioprotection. And then you have some values adopted by different utilities for occupational exposure. And you have the reference value ranging from thousands of, this is in euro, but it is the same more or less in US dollar, from 1,000 to few thousands US dollar per man millisievert, per person millisievert. And then the idea in this range of value is also to take to put more emphasis on the higher level of exposure. So not only to consider the collective exposure, but also to consider the distribution. And you can see that for some utilities, you have, for the higher exposure, you have a factor of 5 of difference or even more between the lowest and the higher level of exposure, in order to reduce in priority the higher exposure. So this is some tools which are used mainly for occupational exposure, because then you are able to compare, to have a collective exposure which is meaningful with regard to the cost of protection. So then this is interesting to see that ICRP developed several publications to discuss how to introduce the economic rationality and the cost-benefit analysis. And progressively, this cost-benefit analysis introduce more and more qualitative value or social factors, and then at the end also discuss the stakeholder involvement and the dialogue to find an optimum value. And this is interesting that in 93, publication 37 introduced what they call the beta value in the monetary value. So that means in the monetary value, you have a first element, which is the cost of the detriment, directly related with the level of detriment and the cost of the value of life, the value of life lost. But then you introduce also some non-objective features on non-health detriment. So this is, in these factors, you have the first element of the monetary value, which is defined directly by the value of year of life lost. But then you can introduce a beta value in order to put more emphasis on some social factors. So then it's mentioned that, however, the process to maintain level of exposure, ALARA, remain essentially a matter of judgment, mixing quantitative and qualitative assessment and field of experience. In publication 55 in the 90s, ICRP discussed largely the ALARA process and how to apply, how to be sure that you reach something which is reasonable or reasonably achievable. And then they refer to the managerial approach and introduce the multi-attribute or multi-criteria analysis. So there are, in this publication, some discussion which type of criteria could be introduced and how to value these different criteria and how to find the optimum option based on multi-criteria analysis. In publication 101, the second part of this publication, part B, the focus is largely on stakeholder involvement. So it is mentioned in this publication that the basic definition given in publication 60 remain valid, but the way in which it should be implemented is now viewed as a broader process. So then it's what they call broadening the process of optimization. And this need to reflect the increasing role of individual equity, safety culture, and stakeholder involvement in modern society. Then, having said that, I would like to come back. I will come back briefly on publication 101, but we introduce, we revise the framework of tolerability, or we are in the process of doing it in publication in the task group 114, which have been created 5 years ago, with the objective to review the historical and current perspective on tolerability and reasonableness of radiation risk, and to clarify and consolidate the ICRP publication 103. And then it's also aiming to prepare the consideration and basis needed for the development of future recommendations. So you know that ICRP has launched a process to revise the general recommendation and to update publication 103. And we are currently opening a dialogue with many stakeholders to clearly identify how to redefine this general recommendation that could be published at the beginning of the next decade. So you are welcome to participate to the debate on this discussion. So in this context, there was ongoing discussion at national and international level on what we mean by tolerability and what we mean by reasonableness. And notably, one of the questions is how far to go, how low we can go, and what is reasonable in terms of low level of exposure, and what does it mean for very low level of exposure, how to cope with that. And this is currently an open debate. And we will also have some discussions. There will be a webinar next week with the World Nuclear Association in order to discuss this topic in the perspective of sustainable development. So the key issue at stake for this task group is first of all to consider the consideration and criteria on which the concept of tolerability and reasonableness are based. The application in different exposure situations. In fact, as you have seen for publication 60 and the model of tolerability, at that time, the model was only applied to what we call now the planned exposure situation. So only for installation and for situations which are considered as normal operation. Then in publication 103, we introduce planned exposure situation, emergency exposure situation, and existing exposure situation. And then the question of limit is challenged with regard to that, and the question of optimization and tolerability is also challenged. So this is one of the objectives of the task group, to revisit the application of the model to be applied to the different exposure situation. Then there is a question how to discuss the trade-off between level of exposure and benefit, and what we mean by the benefit, how to identify the benefit. You have seen that in the cost-benefit model, the benefit was mainly expressed in monetary terms. Is it enough? How to go beyond? In publication 55, for example, with the multi-criteria analysis, we have different value in terms of benefit, how to clarify and how to have tools allowing to discuss this trade-off between level of exposure and benefit. Also to account for sensitive and vulnerable population. This is some element which need to be considered for existing exposure situation, notably for legacy site, for post-accident situation, for emergency, how to cope with vulnerable population. The interest reflected and integrated for human and non-human exposure. More and more, we have to discuss the protection of the environment, how to deal with that, what does it mean? This is some element to be considered. And the strategy to assist in balancing competing value in determining what is tolerable and or reasonable. And then with regard to that, there is all the question of holistic approach which need to be considered. And then at the end, how to best support reasonable value for society. So this new reflection has been largely introduced by the reflection on ethics, which have been published in the publication 138 in 2018. And then the relationship between the core and core ethical value is expressed as follows in publication 138. It is mentioned that to do more good than harm, to avoid unnecessary risk, to establish a fair distribution of exposure, and to treat people with respect. And then it is mentioned that in this pursuit, the two concepts of reasonableness and tolerability, although supported by quantitative method, definitively remain a deliberative nature. Excuse me. So this is clearly some elements that are to be discussed in the new revision of the concept of tolerability and reasonableness. So currently, in publication 138, tolerability is defined as the degree or extent to which something can be endured. And this is a level of risk allowing activity to be carried out without serious consequences. What does it mean, serious consequences? This is something to be considered, both at the individual and collective level. And reasonableness is mentioned to make rational, informed, and impartial decisions that respect other views, goals, and conflicting interests. And then it's referred to moderation, fairness, and practical. While revisiting the framework of tolerability and reasonableness, the task group tried to refine the definition of tolerability, and tolerability of risk is considered as a combination of a risk that is bearable in a specific context. So this is important that there is no universal value. This is in a specific context based on the current value of society. And then tolerability is not only a matter of level of risk, but it's something which could be beyond, and it needs to consider individual and societal level of risk, including the consideration on what we call the construction of health detriment. So it means that if we have evolution of the health detriment, as it is mentioned, I encourage you to check publication 152 from ICRP, discussing the construction of health detriment. And then currently ICRP is discussing to update the value of the detriment. And then if we have some update, that means that the level of risk associated with ionizing exposure could change. And then tolerability also include qualitative judgment, depending on various components and on the specific exposure situation and context. In short, consideration for defining the tolerability of risk is depend on the level of risk, but not only. First of all, it's avoid or at least limit occurrence of TCE reaction, but it should not be understood as a numerical demarcation between what is safe and unsafe. That means that in certain situations, for example, in emergency, you can accept some exposure below the tolerability of risk. And reference level are not generally the right criteria, and exceeding the reference level is not a failure, and then not necessarily the border of tolerability. Then tolerability is a combination of quantitative and qualitative component, including notably the concept of well-being and ethical consideration. And then this question of well-being need to be further considered in the future. It's individual and societal consideration. Potential risk need to be embarked, but it's not easy to introduce probability with regard to potential risk, depending on the exposure situation. Then we also have risk comparison and multi-hazard situation. For reasonableness, as I already mentioned, it's a matter of good judgment, fairness, practicability, and also moderateness. The objective is not to go as to reach a level as low as possible or to go to zero. It's really to find something which is moderate and appropriate to the situation. One point which is important is that optimization has to be considered as a deliberative process and to achieve a reasonable compromise. And this is something which needs to be discussed, the question of process, the question of deliberation, and the question of compromise, and also with all informed stakeholders. And when we say informed, then we need to consider how to develop a radiation protection culture and how to embark the stakeholders in deliberative process. And this is why this is also referred to stakeholder involvement. And then there is a need to embark economic, societal, and ethical consideration. I would say also environmental consideration. Then we have published with the task group a paper in 2022 discussing the 3R approach, which means for reasonableness, relationship, referring to stakeholder, empathy, and trust, rational, referring to technical, contextual, and ethical aspect, and resources, referring to technological, financial, and time resources. And then the objective with this 3R approach, I will come back on that, is to inform the deliberative process. We can also refer usually to publication 101 on broadening the process of optimization, where you have a series of values which need to be considered, which is equity, ability to control, sustainability, intergenerational consideration, individual and social benefit, the level of information, and social trust. The question of trust is something which is quite important because you cannot reach reasonableness without having trust in the process. And so the revised framework is currently presented like that. Instead of having 3 levels as for the model of tolerability, we have only 2 levels, one which is tolerable and not tolerable. And then it is not mentioned unacceptable, but not tolerable. Then we have a series of radiological criteria, which is not necessarily the limit. And then when you are below the radiological criterion, you can discuss the optimization process, which is a deliberative process reaching to reasonableness. But then the objective is not necessarily to reduce the exposure, but to find a compromise, embarking level of exposure, individual and collective level of exposure, embarking some other component to define the well-being and to reflect the different component in relationship, resources, and rational. Then you have, I just put, I will not go into detail, but you have a checklist for relationship, which can be considered when you discuss the process. You have the same for rational, which is strong, honest, well-communicated technical context, and ethical rational. And then you have resources with responsible use of technology and techniques, finance and time consideration, and then you can find again the monetary cost and the timeline to be discussed. Then, excuse me, then we have to clearly emphasize the question of stakeholder involvement in the process. So there is a key role of the deliberative process, and then you can see on the picture some involvement of people after Fukushima to clearly discuss what is the level of exposure and how to understand the level of exposure. And so it's important to highlight the different experience in different situations, relying on core ethical value of dignity, because it's why we need to respect individuals, to promote their autonomy, to implement the procedural ethical value and contribute to trustworthiness. And this procedural ethical value is accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness. We need to favor a dialogue between all concerned stakeholders, to share scientific knowledge, practical experience, and value, because then the question will be to find a discussion between science, practice, and values, and to establish ad hoc structure to engage a respectful dialogue, providing relevant resources for the stakeholders and adequate time schedule, and to clearly include the stakeholders in the decision process, not to have only communication of the decision, but clearly to embark the stakeholders in order to discuss what is reasonably achievable. Then the role of radiological criteria. We have different radiological criteria. We have dose limit, dose constraint, or reference level. They play a dual role in the implementation of the radiological protection system. First of all, they need to contribute to reduce inequity in the distribution of individual exposure to cope with the ethical value of justice. You have seen that even at the beginning of ICRP publication, when we define in publication 26 the distribution of of exposure of occupationally exposed workers or public. And then there is also a need to ensure the consideration of what is not tolerable, and there is non-maleficence value in terms of ethics, and to take into account prudence, justice, as well as dignity. And then for that, we need to have a discussion on benchmark to evaluate the effectiveness of protective action, to discuss the restriction on individual exposure, and then to fix the radiological criteria accordingly, and to have border between tolerable and non-tolerable, which is not always easy to catch. And then there is a need, of course, to have some reference, but also to discuss with specifically according to the situation which is considered. So which radiological criterion to select? This is not so easy. First of all, tolerability and reasonableness are not determined solely by a level of individual exposure or a level of risk. The main thing is based on the tolerable or reasonable nature of exposure situation. There is no risk which can be considered as acceptable. A risk in itself is not acceptable. A situation can be accepted, but not a risk in itself. So there is no universal value, but some guiding principle. 100 millisievert is really a reference level to prevent deterministic effect. 20 millisievert with reference to the selection of the limit value for occupational exposure for planned exposure situation at that time, and 1 millisievert with reference to the limit for member of the public. This value can evolve, but this is some guiding value that you can use to select your specific criterion. And then I remind you the table which have been introduced in publication 103, where you have discussion of band of dose from 20 to 100 millisievert, which refer to not controllable action. And then for this range of value, the objective is really to reduce dose as much as possible and to engage action on the exposure pathway. From 1 to 20, you have to cope with the benefit from the situation, and there is a recommendation to make action on the source on the exposure pathway. And below 1 millisievert, you have to consider the benefit, indirect benefit or societal benefit, and you can make action on the source that can be planned in advance and then to discuss depending on the specific situation. So this is also some guiding element for the implementing reasonableness. Then this is interesting to check that reference value have been proposed for radon, for example, in already in publication 65, the ICRP referred to a value of the range of 10 millisievert per year for radon. For the aviation, the objective was to reach something generally in the range of 5 to 10 millisievert for the people regularly exposed and for the staff in case of aviation. And for accident and long-term phases, the objective is to be in the lower half of the range of 1 to 20 millisievert, with a long-term objective to be in the range of lower than 1 millisievert if possible. Then we also can consider some risk comparison, and then we have some level, as I mentioned in publication 26, and the tolerability of risk with a range of 10-3 per year, 10-6 to 10-5 for member of the public, 10-5 to 10-4 for people, for occupationally exposed people, and then also some lifetime risk to be considered. Then we can also consider the evolution of the radiological detriment, as I already mentioned, and to select the process for specific situation with dialogue. So just a few words about the application, and I will try not to finish in a long period of time to allow for questions. For the revised framework, there are discussions currently for applying this revised framework for medical exposure. What is interesting in the case of medical exposure is the fact that tolerability and reasonableness apply not on the same level, because the objective is not to reduce exposure as much as possible. It's really to find some level of exposure which is appropriate, which is relevant to the patient dose management and center on the patient well-being. And the objective is, of course, to find the good level in order to get sufficient information, notably in imaging or in treatment, in order that at the end, the health of the patient will be improved. So the objective will be really to find a good balance. And then there is an interesting discussion between tolerability and reasonableness, and also the articulation between justification of and optimization. You cannot only discuss in terms of optimization. And then there is some interesting discussion in how to cope with the patient dose. And then depending on radiation therapy, you can be in the range of 100 millisievert, but then depending on the degree of appropriateness, the degree of patient-centeredness, and the optimization on degree of patient safety, you can reduce or you can find the good level depending on age-sensitive group, such as children, pregnant women, and so on. Similarly, for the nuclear sectors, there is a discussion on to support the process by setting up forum for dialogue, first of all for workers, authorities, and citizens, to develop radiation protection culture, and to use decision-making and dialogue tools. And then there is a need to integrate the legal process, because there is already for nuclear installation a large number of processes, both for public and workers and for the protection of the environment, and to establish a level of protection that ensure a better balance between individual and collective dose, and also to embark the question of protection of the environment. And the objective is not to be conservative. It's really to deal with conservatism in exposure assessment at the planning stage and to find the good level of protection. For norm exposure, similarly, there is discussion relying on integrated approach. Then the question with norm is the fact that radiological situation is not the only one. You have to make a benchmark with other consideration and to find the ALARA approach in a realistic approach, combining indoor air quality and energy saving, combining the highest exposure and the global risk. And then, in most of the case, for radon, notably, you are in the range of 10 millisievert and deriving some reference level expressed in becquerel per cubic meter, and then to refer also to national plan. For emergency and recovery, I already introduced some few elements. The selection of the reference level should be taken into account the actual distribution of exposure, the careful balance of many interrelated factors, sustainability of social life and economic activity, the quality of the environment, and the view of relevant stakeholders. So just to conclude, the remaining challenges, in fact, there is a need to have an emphasis not only on the level of exposure, but clearly on to reach a good level of protection with due consideration given to the level of risk associated with ionizing radiation in specific circumstances, but not only. And then it needs to include consideration of well-being, sustainable development, and all hazard approach. And then, having said that, it's easy to say, but not easy to embark. And clearly, further consideration on the question of well-being are welcome. The question of sustainable development, ICRP main commission just published a position paper on this topic of sustainable development. You can find the reference to the paper on the ICRP website. And in this paper, we discuss how sustainable development goals can cope with ICRP recommendation. And then for sure, for optimization, we need to articulate the three objectives of sustainable development, which is social, economic, and environmental consideration. And then all these elements need to be better articulated and find a good way for ICRP to discuss tolerability and reasonableness in this perspective. And then similarly, for all hazard approach, how to compare or to integrate some element referring to chemical toxic or referring to the global quality of indoor air quality or some other component, for example, in the case of hazardous situation, how to integrate natural risk and other risk, man-made potential catastrophic risk, and so on. Then the other point is the importance of considering the process. And then considering the process, it's also how to value the different component, how to set up the process, and how to have regulatory aspect associated with that, and how to engage different dialogue in this perspective. There is also some consideration between justification and optimization. Nowadays, with existing exposure situations, or in the medical field, justification of an optimization principle are largely interrelated. So we need to better address this question. And currently, one task group from ICRP Committee 4 is working on this topic and probably will engage some workshop in the following months. Then there is for sure a need to consider the prevailing circumstances and the specificity of the situation. So we need to see how far to go. We cannot say that everything is specific. We need to have generic guideline, but how to articulate between generic guideline and specific circumstances. And then, of course, we need to ensure the respect of ethical values. And we are currently discussing what does it mean to put the ethical value into practice, and then we expect to set up a new task group on this topic to better investigate the role of ethical values in the process of optimization in the implementation of the radiological protection system. And then, of course, we need to rely on stakeholder involvement. So with that, you can find my email on this slide, and this is a picture of the task group last year for the meeting of the task group. And with that, I stop sharing my screen, and I hope that was understandable for you. And I'm open for any question now, or do not hesitate if you have no time to ask a question, or if you want to come back to some of the elements, to send me an email and to visit the ICRP website to find additional information. I just remind you that all the ICRP publications are free of access up to after 2 years of publication. So you can find most of them directly on the website of ICRP. With that, I give you back the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Thierry, for this wonderful and thoughtful lecture. So this lecture is very useful for our knowledge. So there are certain questions. So we'll go for question answer sessions. So first,
let us open for discussion. Anybody is having?
Yeah, anybody you want to ask something can ask. So I can see there is some questions already written. So Vivek Kaushik is asking that are tolerability and the reasonableness quantifiable or pseudo quantifiable? So, sir.
So sorry, I was checking the mailbox. Can you repeat the question?
Sir, the question is: are tolerability and the reasonableness quantifiable or pseudo quantifiable?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. In fact, as you can see in the historical perspective, at the beginning, the objective was to have only quantifiable value. When we have the cost-benefit analysis, the cost-benefit analysis rely on the fact that you are able to put at least a monetary value at the end, or the equivalent of monetary value. Currently, when we introduce multi-attribute analysis, you can check in publication 55, the multi-attribute analysis, you have some quantified value and some qualitative criteria. But then with the multi-criteria analysis, you are able to put a weight on the qualitative value. That means that if you consider, for example, if we check the value of the environment, or you can say that with this protective action, the value of the environment will be better or much more better, and so on. Then you have a classification, a qualitative classification, and then with multi-attribute analysis, with a utility function, we are able to transform this priority into a single criteria and to quantify, to transform the order of priority into quantification. So this is the way it is done, to start with some element where you can clearly assess the value, with some other which are more qualitative and which reflect the preferences of individuals or the preferences of society. And then this is based on these preferences that we are able in the tools of multi-attribute analysis to find a quantification. But then, beyond that, it's clear that when you check the ethical values and you want to consider some element more qualitatively, it's difficult to put some weighting factors to everything. So it's why when we say deliberative process, more and more in more and more situations, the objective is not to have at the end a quantitative assessment, but it's really to open the dialogue and to find what we call a compromise. And the compromise, this is not a quantitative value, but it's really something which reflects the compromise that you can reach with a panel of stakeholders. Does it respond to your question?
Yeah, I think this gives more clarity on the question. Also, I have one question, sir. As you said that there is that in the chemical industries, the risks are also there. So, as a radiological person, we only see the radiological risk. But if there is there any platform where that we can compare, or some task group in the ICRP where that we can compare the risk of the chemical and the radiological?
Yeah. This is something in the task group 114 that I'm currently sharing. The objective is also to compare with chemical or toxic. We already have a discussion on that, and there is the German Committee on Radiation Protection publish one or two papers on this topic. I can send you this element. In fact, this is possible to make the comparison in terms, but the rationale is slightly different. So we are able to check if we have a similar tolerability of risk, because then they define some reference value for chemical toxic, and there is internationally recognized value for chemical toxic. But then the objective is not necessarily, when you reach this level, you are not supposed to go below. In case of radiation, the value could be higher, but then you are supposed to go below. So it's why this is something which need to be discussed. You have seen, for example, so it's not directly comparable, and it's why when we come back to, this is interesting to come back to publication 26, because in publication 26, which is still valid in the spirit now, when we adopt a limit value, a dose limit in ICRP, we consider that the average dose rate of the population will be 10 times lower. So what do you have to compare? Do you have to compare the dose limit or the value 10 times lower? And this is something which is not directly comparable between chemical and radiation. But we try to go ahead with that, and I hope we have not conclusion on that topic, but this is a topic currently investigated. And if you have some some reflection on that, that will be more than welcome.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. So anyone having here sitting here any question?
Actually,
Yeah, you can speak. It is
regarding the medical exposure now. Sir, you talk about two concepts, appropriateness, and one is patient-centeredness. Can you please elaborate further? Actually, one.
So sorry, you spoke about appropriateness and central.
Regarding medical exposure, you have talked about appropriateness, and another is patient-centeredness. So can you please elaborate what actually what these terms actually mean actually in this context?
In fact, so I'm not a specialist of medical exposure, but one of my colleagues working on this topic in the task group emphasized the fact that in the medical radiation protection, the objective not only in radiation protection, but in the medical field, the objective is to find the appropriate treatment, and the appropriate treatment is not necessarily the treatment which delivers a lower dose, because then you have to embark other elements. To be centered on the patient means that you will have to embark the quality of life of the patient, and so it's why the objective in the medical field, as far as remember what I've been explaining, was really to be sure that finally depending on the patient, depending on the situation of the patient, probably you may have different treatment. This is something that we try to cope with currently in the new task group of ICRP, which is the task group 128 on individualization and stratification of RP system, which means that in fact you cannot work with average people in the medical field. You need to go to take more in detail the characteristic of the patient. But then you need to find a good balance, not to discriminate some patient because of their specific characteristic, but at the same time to find the better approach depending on the characteristic of the patient. So this is why in the medical field, applying reasonableness and tolerability seems to have a different dynamics. But we will try. In fact, we expect to publish a paper on that in the following months. But probably it will be clearer than what I can explain to you today.
Okay.
So if you wish more detail, I can send you some. We have made presentation on this topic, which will go more in detail for medical field.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for a very nice lecture, sir. I would like to ask this tolerability also will vary from different country to country in different parts of the world. So how does ICRP plan to address that? Like we cannot accept a single same criteria for everyone, or how do you go about it, sir? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, we have not we have not defined the final philosophy on this topic for the next publication. But however, what is clear, and this is one of the message in terms of tolerability and reasonableness, there is no universal value. So having said that, this is difficult for ICRP because at the end we will have to propose a system which could be applicable everywhere in the world. So there is no universal value, but we need to have a system applicable similarly all over the world without discrimination. So that means clearly, depending on the specific circumstances, the value of tolerability will be different, significantly different, I don't know, but possibly different. And this is the same for reasonableness. The problem, we had this discussion, for example, when we applied the cost-benefit analysis. I remember to discuss with French people, and then you know that for uranium mining, we have no more uranium mine in France. So last one was closed more than 10 years ago. And then most of the uranium mine are coming mainly from Africa or from Canada, but there is a large number from Africa. And then the question was which monetary value to use for the protection of the workers. And then it was clearly highlighted that because that was a French company, there is a need to apply the French reference value and not to have something which is discriminated for some other people and reaching some different level of exposure. So then there is a mixture between the prevailing circumstances, the specific circumstances in different countries in terms of exposure, in terms of economic and societal environment, but there is also a need to cope with ethical value and to be sure that with regard to the concept of justice and dignity, that will be applied fairly. But then you may probably also refer to natural exposure. The natural background could be significantly different. And then, of course, we will have to cope with that. But what does it mean for the level of tolerability? This is a difficult issue. And so that should be good to have some feedback and some experience on that from different regions in the world.
Okay, sir.
Anybody?
Thank you. Any?
Actually, I have one question, Dr. Thierry. It is a exhaustive presentation. As you have talked about all these 3 R's approach and all, it is very exhaustive, like justification, optimization. Then we are talking about reasonableness and all. But now people or industries are directly looking at this radiological criteria for non-tolerable, where if that could have been raised, automatically many discussions in this justification optimization side will be less burden actually. So whether rising this dose limit is the main point everybody is looking at it instead of because it goes by this whatever this LNT theory based that risk estimate. So what is your comments on this, and in future what will be the
In fact, this is an important question. In fact, the task group that I'm currently chairing will not produce a value for those limits, for example. The objective is to identify some relevant radiological criteria, but beyond the radiological, the value itself is on what is the rationale for deriving radiological criteria. I explain the reason why. In fact, a large part of the radiological criteria is inevitably linked with radiological detriment. And the radiological detriment will depend on the final decision or recommendation from ICRP, how to update the model used for calculating the radiological criteria, how to embark different type of background risk in the calculation of radiological criteria, how to embark or not hereditary effect, how to embark or not circulatory disease. What about the dose rate and dose rate effectiveness factors? So all these elements will influence at the end the value of the radiological detriment. So this is one component of the radiological criteria to be derived. So it's why at this stage it's rather difficult to clearly announce a value. Then what is clearly mentioned in the task group currently, and this is a recommendation where we will go, is the fact that to adopt a radiological criteria, including the dose limit, is largely related to the risk, but not only. And then it's why we try to explain or elucidate as much as possible some different radiological criteria, the meaningful of the radiological criteria, how they are currently used, and of course, what could be the benefit or not to change the radiological criteria. So this is some element to be considered. In fact, we expect to, we are currently discussing at the main commission of ICRP. We have set up a reflection to start to identify the main objective of the new recommendation and the sensitive issue for this general recommendation. And clearly, the concept of dose limit will be one of them, and we are currently envisage to set up a specific reflection on the concept of dose limit in the following year. So I cannot tell you what will be the new value, and you cannot. We can we can expect from the task group 114. We will produce a set of different value which are relevant in different situations, and then based on that, that can help to fix the radiological criteria in the future.
Thank you.
So sorry not to give you the value, but this is the current reflection. I have seen in the chat, I've seen a question with regard to the astronaut. And this is an interesting question because we had a meeting of Committee 4 2 days ago, and we had specifically a discussion on this topic. In fact, for the astronaut, the question of tolerability and also reasonableness is clearly at stake because we are not in an annual risk, but we are much more in a lifetime risk, having in mind that people in only one trip to the moon or one trip to Mars will already have a high level of exposure. So to have a reference radiological criteria per annum will not be relevant. But then clearly, this is some elements that we are currently taken into consideration. We will not develop specific discussion in the task group 114, but we will refer to that, and there will be some specific discussion in the following years on this topic. And I already know that there are some space agencies which already discuss some reference of tolerability in the range of 600 millisievert of lifetime exposure, something like that. So this is some element to be considered and to challenge with the concept of tolerability and reasonableness.
I think it answers Ria's question.
So, if there is no further questions, I just want to add that this video will be available in the IRP YouTube channel. So, whoever wants to listen to the talk later, they can also have it. And if any of the members who have missed it can discuss with the participants and get the links. And with no further question, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my deepest gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Thierry, for providing an excellent overview on the current developments of ICRP on the reasonableness and tolerability, the chronology, as well as the present status and future perspective. Partly, his expertise and insightful presentation have definitely shed new light on the complex topic and greatly expanding our knowledge. I am grateful to all the participants present at different centers and joined online today at the first lecture of this Indian Association for Radiation Protection monthly online lecture series and contributing to the success of this scientific presentation. Your presence has been vital in creating an atmosphere of learning and exploration. A heartfelt thanks to the organizing committee for their dedication and ensuring everything was seamless and well coordinated. I also want to acknowledge the audience for their active participation, insightful questions, and stimulating discussions, which add value and perspective to this session. once again, thank you all for making this event a productive one. I hope we will be meeting soon for the next presentation of this lecture series, and have a very good day. Thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. And I clearly encourage you to send some question, and not only question, but also some proposal to contribute to all this reflection. Thank you so much for this kind invitation, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
everyone.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
One more question. So there is a lag.
Recording and.
How do you just